Welcome back! Ready to learn about some more informal logical fallacies? The next several modules in this course will cover different classifications of logical fallacies. The classifications will be broad reasons why the argument is fallacious. Our first set of fallacies is called fallacies of form. Rather than just tell you what a fallacy of form is, I'm going to share a little story with you. This example comes from the book The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. In the story, the little prince has been meeting different people and learning from what he observes. And one of the people that he meets has a bit of an alcohol problem. The author calls him the drunkard. Their encounter goes like this. "Why are you drinking?" the little prince asked. "In order to forget," replied the drunkard. "To forget what?" inquired the little prince, who was already feeling sorry for him. "To forget that I am ashamed," the drunkard confessed, hanging his head. "Ashamed of what?" asked the little prince, who wanted to help him. "Ashamed of drinking," concluded the drunkard, withdrawing into total silence. Now, most fallacy examples we discuss will not be this long or involved, but think about what's wrong with the drunkard's reasoning. We'll come back to it in a minute. I have to admit that even though I don't drink myself, I still use this kind of reasoning sometimes for other things. So let's talk about what a fallacy of form is. We know what a fallacy is. Arguments that's not really logically sound, but they're persuasive and a lot of people will believe them anyway. We've got that. But what about form? To understand what form is, recall what we talked about in the last module. We talked about 4 different ways an argument could go, starting with the same premise. Those 4 different ways could be called forms. Remember that modus ponens and modus tollens were both valid arguments, while denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent were not. Each argument used a lot of the same words, but the way in which the words were used actually made a big difference. So let's go back to our example with the Little Prince. What's wrong with the drunkard's reasoning for drinking? Well, let's go through it. "Why are you drinking?" the little prince asked. "In order to forget," replied the drunkard. Okay, drinking would make one forget things. "To forget what?" inquired the little prince, who was already feeling sorry for him. "To forget that I am ashamed," the drunkard confessed, hanging his head. Okay, yeah, if I had something that I were ashamed of, I might like to forget that too. "Ashamed of what?" asked the little prince, who wanted to help him. "Ashamed of drinking," concluded the drunkard, withdrawing into total silence. Now, where did this bring us back to? We're back at the beginning of the original premise. He drinks to forget that he's ashamed of drinking. Now, I could imagine myself or other people using this same kind of reasoning. For instance, some people might overeat to help them forget about how much weight they've gained, or they might spend hours on Facebook to help them forget that they aren't getting their work done. Guilty as charged. But logically speaking, does this really make sense? If the drunkard just didn't drink in the first place, he wouldn't be ashamed of his drinking, and he wouldn't feel compelled to drink to help him forget his shame. Now, based on what you know, take a moment and answer the question from the following choices. A fallacy of form is an argument that A. has a structural problem, B. uses premises that don't really matter, C. has unclear terms, D. leaves out important premises. The correct answer here is A, has a structural problem. So in this module, we're going to talk about fallacies that have structural problems. Maybe the words could make a valid argument, but in the way they're being used, they don't. Our first fallacy of form is called circular reasoning. There is a reason why it's called circular reasoning, and that's because the premises plus conclusion don't actually get you anywhere. The conclusion is just restating one of the premises. It might use different words, but it's not giving new information or putting the premises together to come up with new insights. Our story of the Little Prince and the drunkard involves circular reasoning. Now, the reasoning itself isn't necessarily fallacious, although it could be. If the conclusion restates the premises, you'll at least have consistency, but you won't have new information. So trying to use this kind of argument to actually prove something is a fallacy. Here are some examples of arguments using circular reasoning. Classical music is better than country music because country music is not as good as classical music. She must love me because she says she does, and she would not lie to someone she loves, would she? World War I was significant because it had a great impact on society. Now, this third one here might be considered a little bit more subtle because the language is different, but you think about it, it's basically saying that World War I is significant because it was significant. It doesn't say anything about why. Teachers in particular need to be on the lookout for this kind of answer on tests because students will sometimes try to pass these off as real answers. Yes, I speak from experience. So why is a circular argument a fallacy of form? Well, let's look at the form of a circular argument. Many circular arguments look something like this, the first form listed. Premise, P is true. Conclusion, therefore, P is true. So this technically isn't a fallacy, but it doesn't actually tell us anything we didn't already know. Using it to prove something is a fallacy. A circular argument could also look like this. Premise, if P is true, then Q is true. Premise, if Q is true, then P is true. Conclusion, therefore P, or Q, is true. Now this one isn't even a valid conclusion. None of the premises actually said either one of these was true. Both of these cases are commonly called circular arguments, though they are technically different. But remember, these are informal logical fallacies, so that's good enough for our purposes. In both cases, you can see that the form does not follow the form of a valid argument. In both cases, you can see how the premise and conclusion refer to and rely on each other, which, if you think about it, makes a circle. Example 1 follows the first form. Classical music is better than country music because country music is not as good as classical music. This is basically saying classical music is better than country music because classical music is better than country music. It doesn't give any actual reasons why one might be superior to the other. Our third example from the last slide also follows the last form. World War I was significant because it had an impact on society. Basically, it's saying that World War I is significant because it was significant. Now our example 2 is closer to the second form. She must not love me because she says she does, and she would not lie to someone she loves, would she? P equals she loves me. Q equals she says she does, or she wouldn't say she does if she doesn't. We had to reword that one a little bit to make it work. Now, you might notice that identifying fallacies of form is not always an exact science, and that's okay. If you learn the basic ideas, you'll be able to spot them more easily in real life. When is circular reasoning not a fallacy? Well, it's not a fallacy when the point of the argument is that it's circular. For example, someone might say, "It is what it is," when they're stating resigned acceptance of something that they don't like. That's a circular argument, but that's the point of the whole thing. If someone says that to you after you've told them that you broke their expensive vase or something, they aren't giving you any new information, but they aren't pretending to conclude something new from it either. Our next fallacy of form has a nice long Latin name, post hoc ergo propter hoc. Literally, it means after this, therefore, because of this. A simpler name for it in English would be false cause, but the Latin name is commonly used. The post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy assumes that something that happened before something else must have caused it. This fallacy is effective because a lot of times something that happened before something else did cause it, but a lot of times it didn't, or there's no way to tell if it did. That's why using it is a fallacy. One phrase you might hear in conjunction with this is that correlation does not imply causation. If someone commits this kind of fallacy, you may hear others in the room, especially scientists and engineers who have had this drilled into them before, responding with, "Correlation does not imply causation." This is true. Just because two things are related or correspond with each other does not mean that one caused the other. Here are some examples of post hoc ergo propter hoc, or false cause. The American War for Independence happened after the fall of the Roman Empire. Therefore, the fall of the Roman Empire was one of the direct causes of the American War for Independence. Now, if you didn't know your history and you don't look it up, you might actually believe that one. Next one. Hospitals are full of sick people, so hospitals must cause sickness. Well, no. Ignoring the fact that people do on occasion catch bugs or infections in the hospital, the main reason why hospitals are full of sick people is because sick people go there to get better. So that's definitely a false cause statement. Sometimes you might see this kind of argument in conjunction with current events, that such and such event or person caused problems that exist now. This kind of argument is easy to make, but it's more difficult to prove. The important thing here is to remember that correlation does not imply causation. Just because two events or situations are related does not mean that one caused the other. The general form of a post hoc ergo propter hoc statement is P happened before Q happened, therefore P caused Q. Now, this form is not a fallacy if P actually reliably caused Q. For example, premise, I ate a blue popsicle. Premise, my tongue is now blue. Conclusion, therefore the blue popsicle caused my tongue to turn blue. Probably so. That would be a pretty good guess. Now, if you woke up with a blue tongue and you hadn't eaten something blue earlier, you might start to worry. But in this case, you know it's the popsicle. In short, be careful when you see someone asserting that one thing caused another. Think it through. Did it really? It's time for your first practice quiz in this module. Be sure afterward to watch the next video for the next set of logical fallacies.